a moment. Yes, we'll record the talks, but not the discussion after this. So let's go to the discussion. So in this session, we want to explore the gendered politics of social reproduction as they emerge through the building of social and material infrastructures. Just a note here, we are thinking of these two sessions, we are not thinking of these two sessions as conceptually distinct. In fact, they are very much linked to each other. They complement each other. They are conceptually and analytically linked. So just like previously, we have 5 talks here. Every speaker will have 10 minutes. And at the end, we'll have time for discussion. I'll use this 2 minutes paper if needed, or I will interrupt you. Also note here, we'll have one presentation in Spanish. We'll have Maga's presentation in Spanish, but I'll mention it also later. So let me introduce the first speaker. Our first speaker is Sarah Marie Hall. She's a professor in human geography at the University of Manchester. In her research, she explores everyday life and economic change using feminist theories, methods, and praxis. Sarah will speak about intimacy as infrastructure, and I'll leave the floor to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Martina, for that introduction, and to yourself and Nina for organising this. Everyone for being here. Also, thank you for the translation. I think it's amazing how accessible you've made this event, so thank you for that. I also want to say a special shout out to Inspire. That's a women's organisation that I work very closely with, and a few of the women are here today. I know they're also involved in the workshop tomorrow, but yeah, thank you for being here, and thank you for inspiring me in the way that you do. So today I want to share some ideas about intimate infrastructure. Intimacy and infrastructure have more in common than we might think. Both are embedded in everyday experiences. Both rely on a host of material, relational, and spatial connections. Both intimacy and infrastructure can be deeply complicated. They have multiple histories, developments, and possibilities. And importantly, both also need care, maintenance, and repair. So bringing together ideas about intimacy and infrastructure isn't necessarily a new project. There's a lot of research, including by people in this Zoom room, that examines the intimate nature of infrastructure, such as in how infrastructural processes and materials are engaged with in embodied and emotional ways. And this includes work on sanitation, on water, on health, on transport, and more, all of which draw out this corporeal, this embodied, multi-material encounter with infrastructure. Less often is intimacy described as infrastructural. That intimacy provides, enriches, and facilitates necessary everyday structures, services, and processes. And as I argue in my forthcoming book, this is exactly what intimacy does. So when I talk about intimacy, I don't necessarily mean people who are always close in terms of propinquity, that they know each other well. It can also be physical intimacy too, relational closeness. Intimacy is necessary for the reproduction of everyday life. It provides an undergirding structure, the literal definition of which is infrastructure, for daily social and generational basic needs. Intimacy is an infrastructure of social reproduction, and I would argue it's crucial to the everyday life of economic change, which tends to be my interest. So to be clear, intimacy as infrastructure also often plugs the gaps that's left by a retreating state, and it's infused then with contradiction, tension, and deterioration. So with this short intervention, and in a chapter of the book, I play with this notion of intimate infrastructure as a device for understanding everyday lives and afterlives in times of economic change. Going beyond understanding everyday relationships as only constituting family and friends, with the work I'm trying to build on some previous stuff I've done that thinks about a much broader range of social relations, which includes intimacy. It centres the role of intimacy in creating relational social infrastructures, this undergirding social fabric that's composed of our everyday relations, so kin, kith, which is also known as family and friends, and intimacy, through which everyday life is maintained during times of economic change and crisis, which in my work has included austerity, Brexit, and devolution. So my aim with these ideas is to develop, both in terms of the theory and the empirical interest, how intimate, relational, and social infrastructures are made and remade during and after economic change. So part of my approach is to engage deeply and meaningfully with writings about infrastructure as intimate. So some of you might have seen Ara Wilson's paper, where she argues that infrastructures shape the conditions for human life. And she points out that infrastructure's kind of key points, or the key reference definitions that we hold socially about infrastructure, tend to include transportation, energy, communications, water, and waste. And she argues that these are systems that are not routinely associated with intimacy. Her argument then is that they should be. There's also a wonderful paper by Iona Datta and Nabila Ahmed, and they extend these ideas with their research on urban violence. So they argue that the city is this kind of assemblage, it's this bringing together of intimate infrastructure that enables us to examine from a gendered perspective the layered nature of violence and its role in physical and digital infrastructure. When they talk about infrastructure, they also talk about water sources and blocked drains. So in both these pieces and in many others, the gendered dimensions of infrastructure are thought of as intimate, and they draw heavily on feminist and queer scholarship. But again, the focus is placed on what you might think of as the social life of physical infrastructure, rather than thinking about infrastructure differently. And so I want to ask, and my provocation is, what about intimacy as infrastructure? So in some of my early work on everyday life in austerity, I've used the metaphor of a tapestry to describe how carefully woven fabrics of family and extra-family relations form everyday social infrastructures. That is, patterns of social relationships of all varieties, family, friendship, intimacy, strangers, acquaintances, are interwoven. Each stitch is dependent on the next. This kind of infrastructure then, what you might think of the warps and wefts of a tapestry, that's how tapestry is made, in case you're not sure, are complex and careful. A combination of practices and relationships draw together a bigger picture in social life. So this approach, I think, is useful to flip the idea of infrastructure as intimate and instead to think about intimacy as an infrastructure. It's also important as well to think about how, coming back to the tapestry metaphor, a tapestry masks a messiness of threads and knots and loose ends. So what we see is the pretty picture, but there's always a relatively messy and unattractive underside. And the absence from view of this underside is, for me, very similar to the invisibility of socially reproductive labour. Coming back to the notion of infrastructures as understructures, reproductive labour can be thought of as the threads and stitches of the tapestry that are woven together to create a fuller, complete picture. One of the reasons why intimacy isn't thought of often as infrastructure, I think, is because of the very firmly held association between intimacy social infrastructure and the home, and the idea that the domestic and private spaces are the key sites of gendered care work. And this means that reproductive work in communities and societies, like the amazing work that Inspire do, but also childcare, educational provision, healthcare, and so on, is often not thought of as reproductive labour. There's also different challenges within different disciplines too. So I know some of my colleagues in feminist economics might not consider something socially reproductive if it's paid, which is really interesting. So there was all these tensions around where the labour is situated, if it's formalised or not, if it's waged or not, but also that sometimes some of those labours can be devoid of the care, the emotion, and the interpersonal connections that we often associate with reproductive labour. But as feminist contributors have long argued, the work involved in social reproduction is the labour that enables societies and economies to function. Social reproduction is itself an infrastructure on which to build societies and economies. It's a complex network of people, practices and politics, labour, love and life. It does the work of maintaining and sustaining life worlds. And while they're not the same, and I'm not arguing that they are, intimacy and intimate connections of care, bodies, labour, policies and more is also necessary for ensuring everyday social and intergenerational reproduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Very interesting. It's very interesting to think, in fact, for me, that just how physical infrastructures have been attacked, have been destroyed by the current crisis. It's also intimacy and social relations that have been attacked, and it's important to recreate these relations. So thanks a lot for your thoughts, for sharing your thoughts. Let's move to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Christina Temenos. Christina is a reader in human geography at the University of Manchester. Her research is focused on health inequalities and the politics of access to care in cities globally, developing this work in relation to policy mobilities, drug use and treatment, public health, housing, economic austerity, environmental sustainability, transport, and climate change. Christina's talk will be on gendered politics of marginality, institutionalizing and hiding from care. Christina, I'm turning the mic to you now. Is it okay?
Okay, great. Thanks, Martina. And just shout at me because I'm also going to be reading. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Martina and Nina, for organizing this event and for the invitation to speak. I've really enjoyed all of the presentations so far, so thank you for that. And today I'll be talking a bit about my current research project called Urban Crisis Public Health at the Intersection of Economic and Social Change. So this is a research project which is operating over 4 years that looks at how...
Sorry, Christina, can you please slow down a little bit?
Yes. So this is a research project that operates over 4 years, and it's looking at how 3 urban areas, Greater Manchester, the Athens metropolitan region, and Santiago de Chile, are implementing strategies to deliver healthcare to vulnerable and marginalized communities during times of intersecting crises. And in the project, we understand crisis as referring to multiple kinds of disruption of the status quo. So health crises such as COVID, economic crises, for example, austerity budgets, political crises such as the estallido, the protests in Chile, and structural crises, so chronic underfunding of the English NHS, pressures on FONASA, which is the Chilean health system, Brexit, and ongoing widening social inequalities. We're in the 3rd year of the research, and we are still conducting research in Santiago and Athens, with the Manchester bit being finished already. And just to shout out that it's not a singular project. The team consists of myself, as well as a postdoctoral researcher, Jess Lintz, a research assistant in Greece, Christina Trandi, and a PhD student, Soteria Kyriakidou. And we're partnering with an organization, STEP, standing for People, which is a street outreach organization in Athens, as well as with the University of Chile's Institute for Housing. The aim of the project itself is to examine how cities manage intersecting crises of health, social inequalities, and economics. And we're also analyzing how urban experimentation happens in the wake of crisis and its relationship to increasing access to care in cities. And this focuses on 4 different areas: homeless healthcare and housing first, substance use addictions and treatment, social prescribing and social pharmacies, and urban health services innovations, more broadly speaking. And through that, the research is interested in 3 things: whether there have been particularly innovative strategies that have worked, that have been introduced during times of crisis and have worked, and whether they've remained sustainable. What are the challenges of delivering care during times of crisis and challenges associated with trying and maintaining new strategies for care delivery? And third, whether and how policies affect day-to-day processes of how healthcare is delivered for some of the most marginalized. Now, given that we're in a session on the gendered politics of social reproduction, I sort of want to out myself at the beginning and note that the project itself is not epistemologically centered within feminist theory, and nor was gender a particular axis around which the analysis was based. However, it is a project that at its heart is about care and the socially reproductive forces that shape it during times of crisis. And care, whether formal or informal, is always gendered. And my comments today then are based on reflections around who provides and who receives care in particularly marginalized spaces and among communities that experience some of the most extreme stigma, discrimination, and marginalization within society. And so what I want to do is to use this time to challenge myself as well to begin to think through what a feminist ethic of care might bring to a political urban geography of crisis. So if we are to build what Joan Tronto calls caring democracies, societies that place social reproduction and an ethics of care at the center of decision-making and governance, how might that look for those most marginalized? A simple answer might be something along the lines of marginalization simply wouldn't exist. There'd be no homelessness and thus no need for a specialist response to homeless healthcare. Problematic drug use wouldn't be criminalized, thereby piling on challenges and barriers to treatment. Medicine would be affordable and available to all. Yet presenting these seemingly simple answers in political forums today will most likely be met with challenges of it being a sort of naive utopian vision. But rather than seeing caring democracy as a utopia, I'd argue it might be more useful to think about where we are in the present and how to build a transformative and caring governance infrastructure. And that begins with thinking about who is building the infrastructure and for whom is it being built. In my work, not only with this project, but also across several studies I've undertaken since 2010, the gendered, classed, and raced breakdown of who is providing and receiving care has been relatively unsurprising and relatively uniform. So healthcare workers are largely women, and in these fields in particular, they are largely from racial majorities, which is not necessarily the case in the healthcare sector overall. Care managers and policymakers, predominantly men, are also largely from middle-class racial majority communities, and those accessing homeless healthcare and drug services are also predominantly men. And while traditionally this population has been working-class men from racial majorities, like for example in the UK that would be white working-class men, this has very much changed in recent years. So in Manchester, Athens, and Santiago, it is increasingly refugees and migrants who are presenting as homeless and in need of care. It has long been acknowledged that women are a hidden homeless population, and they are also less likely to access services for substance use. And thus services are largely centered around and designed around those who do present for care, centered around the sort of the traditional single male. And best practice models of care are also then developed, imported, and implemented, which replicate the gender dynamics of services across cities, and thus the danger in reality that not only are best practice services reproduced, so too are there barriers that exist within them. So in past work on policy mobilities, visibility has been a key node on which a political action has always turned. When a problem such as public drug use is visible, space opens for political action, which is not always straightforward. So in Manchester, for example, under a centre-left Labour Council public space protection order, which essentially criminalised homelessness and public drug use, was pushed through amid the chaos and confusion of the COVID response. While in Athens, under a conservative government, a supervised drug consumption room was implemented and being shown as a successful state-of-the-art program based in best practice. Now, neither of these interventions has stemmed homelessness nor drug use in the cities, although I should note that the purpose of the supervised consumption site is not to prevent drug use, but rather to prevent overdose deaths and connect people with other forms of drug treatment, which it has done.
Christina, you have one more minute.
One more minute, okay.
Yes.
And so I would say that the spectacle of housing and drug crises are still clearly visible across both cities. And this has been undergirded more recently in Manchester by the Home Office's attempts to clear the backlog of asylum applicants, leaving those with decisions nowhere to move on to, so leaving them homeless. So not only are inadequate housing infrastructures contributing to people sleeping on tents on the steps of Town Hall, but health issues that normally accompany unhoused people are different with migrants. They're less likely to have substance use problems, but very likely to need mental health services, and thus models of care and levels of services are challenged by such crises. So again, then we come to the question of how we build caring democracies when best practice models of care are reflective of existing barriers. And here I just want to make the point that it might help to think with Nancy Fraser's use of the idea of counterpublics. So drawing on Gramsci, she notes that conflicts between dominant bourgeois and other social groups around the role and use of public space has long characterized debates on and in the public sphere, and contends that there is no real singular ideal of the public, and that indeed the existence and acknowledgement that there are multiple publics can lead to more emancipatory and democratic governance. So I think I'll actually just leave there. I had a bit more to say, but I want to give time for questions as well. I think the final 2 points that I really want to make, though, within this is that the work of creating caring democracies needs to pay attention to both the material and social realities of how we might get to make alternative infrastructures and what is reproduced both in alternative futures as well as reproduced within best practice. So I'll end there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Christina. That was amazing. It was great to listen to the first output for me of your very interesting project. We are really looking forward to read or listen more about this. This idea of how we are building caring democracy. One answer to this, as you have also pointed out, is through by looking at the minor, not a day-to-day interaction, but there are multiple ways. Thanks for your ideas, for sharing your ideas. We will discuss more in the discussion later. Thank you very much. So let's move to our third presentation. Our third speaker for today is Magali Marega. Magali is an anthropologist and a postdoctoral researcher in the Work and Inequality Seminar at the Colegio de Mexico. Maga's talk will be in Spanish, so if you need translation, please go to the English translation channel. Maga, the floor is yours. I think that...
Intento compartir pantalla.
Sí.
Nina will share.
Pues
Sí, puedes intentar y otra vez.
Ahí.
Sí, está bien.
If there's any problem with the translation, please let us know.
Yes. Y Maga, la cosa importante es como hablar más lento que lo normal. ¿Y qué prefieres? ¿Que interrumpimos cuando ya está la hora de terminar la presentación o poner como un papel para
No,
avisarte?
si me pueden interrumpir mejor
Okay.
hablando.
Okay. Martina, we can interrupt 2 minutes or when the time comes. Okay. Awesome. ¿Cuándo
Perfecto.
quieres?
Bueno, muchas gracias. Qué gusto estar compartiendo en este espacio. Mi presentación se llama Mujeres Andamios, formas de politicidad y sostenibilidad de la vida en el trabajo de mujeres trabajadoras de la construcción en Bolivia y en México. Forma parte de mi tesis doctoral, que la realicé en Ciesas, Ciudad de México. Entonces, bueno, en esta presentación propongo reflexionar en torno a las formas de organización y de politicidad de mujeres trabajadoras de la construcción en estos dos países, especialmente me centro en la zona metropolitana del Valle de México, aquí en la Ciudad de México donde estoy, que abarca también algunos municipios del Estado de México, y en la zona metropolitana de La Paz y el Alto en Bolivia. Voy a estructurar esta presentación presentando en primer lugar algunas características del trabajo de mujeres albañiles en ambos países y en segundo lugar las formas organizativas que despliegan. Quiero empezar remarcando que una gran característica de la dinámica de urbanización en nuestras ciudades latinoamericanas es el protagonismo que ha tenido el trabajo de mujeres en los procesos de autoconstrucción de viviendas y constituye una dinámica central en los modos de hacer ciudad. Un porcentaje significativo de las mujeres de clases populares y trabajadoras ha participado de los procesos de construcción de sus propias casas y de casas de familiares, y por lo tanto tienen conocimientos y destrezas específicas en la actividad de la construcción. Sin embargo, y también es otra característica importante de este fenómeno, este trabajo de construcción de las condiciones materiales de existencia, de sus viviendas y entornos sociales, está sumamente invisibilizado. En nuestros territorios latinoamericanos, históricamente se han configurado mercados de trabajos fuertemente generizados y racializados. El trabajo en el sector específico de la construcción edilicia se ha desarrollado en torno a las dinámicas de la lógica del modelo de acumulación en el sector de la construcción, del sector inmobiliario, pero también tiene que ver con el papel de los estados, en este caso de México y de Bolivia, los niveles también de organización de las y los trabajadores, así como también las dinámicas familiares, las relaciones de poder entre los géneros, las construcciones sexogenéricas y también vinculado a prácticas racistas. En términos generales, el sector de la construcción atraviesa ámbitos muy diversos y heterogéneos en los que predominan las condiciones de trabajo precarias y en los que históricamente se ha utilizado fuerza de trabajo masculina y racializada. A pesar de estos desafíos, la construcción presenta oportunidades significativas para la inclusión y participación de mujeres y personas de diversas identidades sexogenéricas. Las mujeres que trabajan en el sector en estos dos países señalan que perciben una remuneración más alta en comparación con otras ocupaciones a las que tradicionalmente se las ha relegado, como el trabajo doméstico, por ejemplo. Pero aún así, la brecha salarial entre los géneros es muy significativa. En Bolivia, la presencia de mujeres constructoras manifiesta una larga tradición que se remonta por lo menos a la década de 1930, tras la Guerra del Chaco, cuando el país perdió un porcentaje significativo de la población femenina, de la población masculina, perdón, principalmente mano de obra indígena en la contienda ante Paraguay. Luego tuvieron centralidad, perdón, voy a apagar porque creo que está interrumpiendo mucho el WhatsApp. Perdón. Luego adquirió también mucho protagonismo la cooperación internacional en los programas de trabajo por alimentos, donde se contrataba a mujeres para el trabajo de empedrado de calles, construcción de muros, tabiques y demás. Y luego, en la gran crisis que sufrió Bolivia en los 90, se dieron programas de emergencia laboral donde también las mujeres trabajaban en el sector público. Entonces, en Bolivia está muy vinculada la inserción de mujeres, sobre todo a estos planes municipales y nacionales de trabajo. Y en las últimas décadas adquirió visibilización bastante visibilización la conformación de ASOMU, que es la Asociación de Mujeres Constructoras de La Paz y del Alto, pero también en 2019 se formó una asociación a nivel nacional que es la AMUCBOL. Y esto me parecía importante para pensar este tema de las infraestructuras. El gobierno municipal de La Paz creó el programa Barrios y Comunidades de Verdad a partir de una política urbana basada en la democracia participativa, y allí las juntas vecinales, los clubes de madres y otras organizaciones barriales se organizaron para mejorar las condiciones infraestructurales de sus propios barrios. Y una vez más ahí el papel de las mujeres fue central. Muchas de las mujeres que participaron en estos programas a nivel nacional y local continuaron trabajando en las alcaldías y en sus propios barrios y comunidades. Y en México, por su parte, identifiqué 3 grupos generacionales de mujeres que ingresaron en diversos periodos. Un primer grupo que ingresó en los años 90, sobre todo en la construcción de estos programas de viviendas sociales en el Estado de México. Posteriormente, hace unos 10 años, el gran boom de la construcción en la Ciudad de México, que va desde grandes plazas comerciales, hoteles, construcciones residenciales. Ahí fue también un gran ingreso de mujeres en la construcción. Y por último, durante la pandemia, un grupo importante de mujeres y personas de la disidencia de género se acercó a los oficios de la construcción a partir de la pandemia justamente, y algunas conformaron pequeños colectivos, que la mayoría vinculados a movimientos feministas, como los que estoy pasando ahora en la presentación. Ahí están las serruchas, Cueva de la Selva, las chalanais, Plomeras en Acción, Chalanas Girls, son Talachas Girls, son como una explosión de pequeñas colectivas feministas que hacen oficios en la construcción y que incorporan a personas de la disidencia sexogenérica vinculados a los movimientos feministas, hacen mucho uso de las redes sociales y de las tecnologías para estas formas organizativas. Y entonces...
Sorry, Maga, you've got 2 more minutes, please.
Perfecto, ya voy terminando. Entonces, yo lo que caracterizaba de estas formas organizativas es que en Bolivia las mujeres recurren a elementos de la tradición campesina, comunitaria y mara para generar una asociación que retoma elementos, por un lado, de la forma sindical clásica, pero también de la forma organizativa comunitaria indígena. Y también otros lineamientos vinculados a la cooperación internacional y a las dinámicas de las ONGs. Yo a esto le llamo una politicidad abigarrada, ya que confluyen diferentes tradiciones organizativas y reciben también el apoyo de entidades públicas para acceder al trabajo en la construcción y para aprender el oficio. En México, en cambio, las redes se crean en torno a las organizaciones barriales de amistad y parentesco. Antes de la pandemia no había encontrado organizaciones específicas sobre mujeres en la construcción, pero a partir de la pandemia empezaron a aparecer estas colectivas, que son bastantes, son pequeñas y están destinadas a capacitarse en oficios de la construcción. Entonces, la economía feminista y la antropología feminista del trabajo permiten, para mí, entender este diferencial de explotación al que se someten ciertos cuerpos y territorios. Y por un lado, el sector de la construcción es estratégico para la acumulación de capital, pero también para otros sistemas de dominación como el patriarcado y el racismo. Y al mismo tiempo, la construcción de viviendas constituye una actividad central para los procesos de sostenibilidad de la vida. Y la participación femenina en el sector no solo representa un gran potencial para la equidad de género en el mercado de trabajo, sino también para crear formas de gestionar las propias condiciones de existencia. La creciente presencia de mujeres en el mercado formal de la construcción no garantiza automáticamente una mayor igualdad si no cuestionamos las condiciones de precarización existentes en el sector, ni tampoco la arraigada cultura machista y patriarcal que rige las dinámicas laborales. Y para terminar, desde las propias mujeres aparecía mucho un sentido vinculado al ser múltiple. Ellas se identificaban como yo soy múltiple. Es uno de los varios sentidos que estas mujeres constructoras señalaban tanto en Bolivia y en México, para dar cuenta de la experiencia del trabajo como un continuum en la ciudad, además, que resalta la interdependencia comunitaria, afectiva y material que a nivel intergeneracional y desde los ámbitos cotidianos hacen posible la sostenibilidad de la vida. Son mujeres andamios las que cotidianamente construyen nuestras ciudades en América Latina y sostienen la vida. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very, very much, Martha. This was amazing. I haven't heard of these women builders, and thank you very much for sharing your research with us. I have many questions on this, but we'll have the time to discuss it after the talks, the next two talks. So now we have Aliki Kutlu with us. Aliki is an ESRC postdoctoral fellow based at the Department of Politics at the University of Manchester. Her research focuses on the intersections between social reproduction and utilities-based indebtedness in Southern Europe and explores how the everyday realities of life and debt are shaped by gendered and capitalist power relations at times of crisis and restructuring. Aliki, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thanks for having me. Okay, I'll try to share my screen, but I have an elaborate plan to share. Okay.
Okay, we can see it, but it's not full screen. Yes.
Wait. There is more. Okay. I want to do something else so that I have my notes and I can see you both, so.
No worries, take your time.
Sorry. Yeah, okay, let's go with that. I'll have the notes on the side. Thanks again for having me. And as Martina said, unlike most presenters today, I'm a political economist by trade. But my work focuses on the gendered experiences of urban life with debt. And today I will talk about the connections between gender, social reproduction, and the urban from the vantage point of utilities indebtedness, drawing on my PhD research in Thessaloniki, Greece. So basically, my argument is that the urban is a key terrain of social reproduction, is constitutive of the gendering of depletion, discipline, and care, the main dimensions of the lived realities of death, but the urban also carries the possibilities of their degendering. I will walk you through this argument by first connecting utilities, social reproduction, and the urban, while also explaining why and how gender matters when we're thinking about the experiences of utilities, infrastructures, and utilities-based indebtedness. I will then discuss how women in Thessaloniki fell into utilities-based indebtedness and move on to focus on managing debt and how it is gendered. I will discuss first depletion. I will discuss depletion and discipline that constitute experiences of this debt and how they are gendered, and then contemplate the extent to which care and solidarity networks that intersect with these experiences works towards degendering depletion and discipline, and the possibilities they carry for doing so more systematically. So to social reproduction, utilities, and the urban, there has been some work more recently about their connections, but there still need to clarify them a little bit, because as Mantha said in the previous session, we tend to think about these connections more so in the global south and as issues related to development projects and urbanization processes. However, in the global north and the places that don't fit the north-south divide very well, they tend to go unnoticed. So drawing on feminist political economy and feminist geography, I understand social reproduction as the process of the production of life in capitalism. This process, as it takes place, encompasses a fundamental contradiction between profit-making on one hand and life-making and sustaining processes on the other. And much of the latter processes is carried through women's unpaid and unrecognized emotional and material labor. Then we have utility infrastructures, which are key for providing us access to water and energy. These are key inputs for life-making and sustaining processes in the everyday. Their operation and governance are tied to local context, and it is a big part of social reproduction and how it is organized on the national level and on the global level. And then we have the urban, which is a terrain in which utilities operate and our everyday life takes place. And as such is a key terrain of social reproduction, where the contradiction between profit-making and life-making plays out in context-specific ways. Now, when it comes to gender, it's not just talking about men and women, as you all know. It has an analytical meaning. It is an analytical category, and by that I mean that it orders how we think and act by privileging identities, qualities, and characteristics associated with masculinity over those associated with femininity. And it's important to stress that gender and class relations intersect, because the logic of capital, we have the logic of capital on the one hand, which operates by establishing dualisms that put in place divisions in order to establish and perpetuate domination. So gender as a marker of embodied difference and as a system of meaning fits into this logic, which makes global political economy gendered and prompts us to think about gendered impacts of social and economic processes and practices as not accidental. So now to the specifics of my research on the Greek crisis and utilities-based indebtedness. Well, the Greek crisis erupted in 2009, when the Greek state was at the verge of defaulting on its debt payments. And to avoid that, it signed 3 loan agreements with the European Central Bank, European Commission, and the International Monetary Fund between 2010 and 2015. Loans were conditional to the rolling out of austerity and liberalization. And it is in this context that the Greek state offloaded its debt onto households through 4 key processes, which you can see on the slide. I'll summarize this. The slide has more details. So these processes are the neoliberal restructuring of the labor market, which made work and wages more precarious. Then we have welfare retrenchment, which cemented the role of the extended family as shock absorber of last resort. We have the introduction of emergency taxes and increases in taxation, by which the state is appropriating household income to make its debt payments. And finally, we have the efforts towards the privatization of state-controlled utilities, through which utilities cost increased to make them more profitable and attract investors, with the state aiming to use the revenue from their privatization to make its debt payments. All of these processes are constitutive of a crisis in social reproduction, And it is in this context that utilities-based indebtedness proliferates. Because social reproduction became increasingly more insecure for more sectors of the population. What's interesting about this kind of debt is that it is an outcome of social reproduction as a process in life making and sustaining practices, because households had fewer inputs at their disposal while faced increased costs, and they adjusted to this situation by temporarily displacing the costs of their bills to secure the reproduction of their members and at times of their extended families. Women are more prone to this kind of debt because their financial capabilities are constrained by gender divisions of labor in and outside of the home, because they spend time and money to care and support household and extended family members, and they tend to receive lower wages than men, especially in feminized jobs in hospitality or education or certain sectors, because the labor markets are gendered. So now to the most interesting part and related to previous discussions across panels, across sessions. That comes from managing utilities-based indebtedness. So managing utilities-based indebtedness involves dealing with the threat of disconnection, paying incoming bills and fractions of debt to avoid this threat. And the response of people was economizing, which involved also financial calculation around what do we do to live our lives now and live our lives in the future, to be able to continue existing. And these objects of calculations were in areas.
Sorry for interrupting, Kaliki. 1 more minute, please.
Yeah. Corporeal comfort is food, well-being, socializing with friends, starting families and moving in with partners were aspects of managing debt. And overall, this life was precarious, and this precarious living is a condition inflicted upon bodies, and it is carried out through them. And we have 2 aspects. One is discipline, which fosters and alters attachments to labor markets. And then we have depletion, which is a gap between the outflows and the inflows that sustain health and well-being, and it is corporeal, material, and emotional. So because I don't have much time, I have included some quotes here for you to see about how gender is, how discipline is gendered, and this has to do with locking more women into more unpaid reproductive work, and locks them also into paid work under worse pay and conditions than that of men, to keep their households making payments and contribute to their life-making and sustaining processes. On the other hand, we have gender depletion, and discipline operates through depletion. Because women become the primary managers of debt, we have mothers spending more time and effort in reproductive labor. And women without children spend more time and effort in devising strategies to get by and make payments than their partners. Along these violent realities, there were some care and solidarity networks in their everyday lives, which took place across kinship networks and across friendship networks. And we have these networks operating along the lines of caring for and about one another, which are characteristics that are feminized and devalued in our societies. now there were elements of solidarity and mutual aid, with mutual aid being primarily done through kinship networks, but there were small acts of solidarity across friendship networks. And solidarity was more prevalent among friends rather than mutual aid in material ways when it comes to helping with money. So these networks basically respond to gender effects and harms of debt. So in a sense, they work towards degendering the resilience to the depletion and discipline through debt, because the costs are shared and depletion is alleviated. However, my question is whether they challenge how our economies and societies are designed and operate. And here is something that I would like to reflect with presenters across sessions as well. My instinct is that because mutual aid is practiced in and through intimacy primarily, the extent to which this poses a challenge is somewhat limited. And that's because I think we need, by way of conclusion and not do more time here, these basically more sustained challenges require building necessary infrastructures that are socialized and socializing to practice care as mutual aid. Doing these practices along the lines of intimacy is great and it helps, but because intimacy subsidizes the way that the society currently works, it would be not enough to reach to caring democracies, as Christina put it. So thank you very much, and I'm really sorry I went over time.
Thank you very much, Aliki. No worries about this. It was very interesting to hear about, to listen about your research. There are many questions. One of them may be the long-term legacies of these networks, but we'll speak about this later. Let's go to our last speaker for today. Last but not least, we have Eda Beyazit. Eda is a research fellow in active travel and micromobility at the University of West of England, Centre for Transport and Society. Eda will talk about social reproduction, domestic work, and precarity. I will not say more. I will give the mic to Eda.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much for being here with us.
Thank you, Martina, and thanks a lot for all these inspiring discussions and talks. I know it's been a long day for everyone, so I will try to be a little bit quick, but let me know if this doesn't work. Can you see my full screen and not my notes?
No, we are seeing your notes as well.
Okay, so I'll just do the usual.
Mm-hmm.
Just a second. So just to save some time here, I will say a few words. So just today's presentation that I'll do, just a minute, is based on my work as Urban Studies Foundation International Fellowship. Just so hopefully this will be fine.
Yes, it's fine now.
Okay, great. I worked on this project with at the University of Manchester about 2 years ago, I think, or a year and a half, with Professor Karen Lucas. And so this work is a little bit out of my comfort zone, I would say. So maybe be kind to me with questions. So coming from more transport and urban planning fields. So I will talk in will structure my talk in 5 sections, and following a brief introduction, of course, like with all these sort of renowned researchers here in feminist geography and labor geography, so I'll just keep it very short. And then I'll explain why we were drawn to this research during the pandemic, and briefly explain the methodology and summarize the key findings of the study and draw some conclusions. But you might have noticed that I'm taking you to the other side of the Aegean Sea, so to Istanbul now for this case study. But before that, so as you know, like gender-based division of labor and in households places the responsibility for production, reproduction, and care work on women. And the commodification of women's labor and the commoditization of care work have created for some women to be liberated to enter the paid labor force, and this created a gendered loop in which women, sorry, I'm taking a little bit slower now. So, but I've shared my notes, so hopefully that will help the translators, who are doing brilliant work, by the way. To be liberated to enter the paid labor force, this created a gendered loop in which women with paid employment hire other women to supply the labor of social reproduction. And an important chain in this loop is the domestic workers, who are often devalued, invisible, and insecure. Moreover, for domestic workers, the domain of work and the domains of home and leisure are indistinguishable from each other. Understanding how overlapping work and personal activities shape domestic workers' practices outside the home is key to grasping the effects of changing labor dynamics on the location of new forms of care and for travel patterns between home and care. And this has been an ongoing question, still waiting quite a lot of case studies to respond to, I reckon. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, domestic workers faced new challenges, with some having to choose between becoming live-in workers or staying as live-out workers. Many experienced job losses due to employers' fear of contagion and limited transport services. This affected both live-in and live-out care workers, both in the global north and global south. The pandemic raised questions about mobility and privilege, and highlighted the disparities in who could afford to be less mobile under the lockdown. During the pandemic, more employers started working from home, leading to new workplace dynamics, so employers staying more at home than usual. Additionally, women undertook on more caregiving responsibilities compared to men, intensifying patriarchal dynamics in their private spheres. Women are not constitutive elements of privacy in home and work spheres. They're subordinates in both. So we discuss in this presentation and in the work that we've done, which will hopefully be published at some point, we ask, could female domestic workers be a constituent element of their daily mobility? Would their strategies compensate for inequalities they face in transport? And to what extent could pandemic immobilities be resolved through new methods of organizing transport? We argue that the mobility sphere of female domestic workers can be defined as social reproduction in transit, or wherever the mobile practices of social reproduction occur. We are particularly interested in the ways in which domestic workers in Istanbul negotiate this mobility sphere and fashion precarious service, which I will explain. That's an emerging mode of informal mobility in the form of a minibus shuttle to fill in the gaps of cities' public transport networks during the COVID-19 pandemic. You can see a little sort of circle around here, like, which is one of the minibuses that is used by domestic workers on these routes. So just to give you a bit overview of the methodology. So of course, like during the pandemic, like in many cities, Istanbul also had some bus routes that were eliminated and the frequency and capacity were limited. So those without a car had to find new ways of traveling. My context from a previous study that I did with female domestic workers, again in Istanbul, led us to Esenyurt, which is, as you can see, here is more like the center of Istanbul towards my right, and Esenyurt, which is in the peripheries of the city. So domestic workers initiated this model, this service, and to take them from Esenyurt to Başakşehir, which is again in the peripheries of Istanbul. So Esenyurt has a diverse multiracial population of almost 1 million citizens. So it's more than some cities actually. We use various ethnographic methods, including observing the physical space, conducting semi-structured interviews. We also surveyed the users of the service. So I'll just briefly summarize the findings in under 5 headings. So first of all, about reconstructing the mobility sphere, we found out that service is not like any other shared mode of transport. We observed the organizational capability of female domestic workers in reconstructing their mobility spheres during the pandemic. These strategies including recruiting new members, designating the service route, and arranging payment. Secondly, service is also a platform for women to meet one another and learn from each other's experiences and strategies they developed over the years against patriarchy and their rights as domestic workers, including their demands for social security and health insurance. As one of my interviewees commented, when you socialize, you become aware of your rights. Even if you don't practice, awareness is enough for you. Additionally, I have witnessed women finding each other better paying jobs and better employers. So in this sense, service is a new practice of solidarity economy. Gated communities in the urban periphery produce work opportunities, especially for women living in nearby poorer neighborhoods in the global south. As one of my interviewees highlighted, these areas attract many domestic workers. So she says, there are many sites as like meaning a gated community in Turkish, around Bahçeşehir, Başakşehir neighborhoods that I cannot even name, like a factory. A service drops off its passengers in front of each site and domestic workers get off. You know, one worker from every household in Esenyurt goes to the houses around Bahçeşehir as a worker. And the pandemic triggered this sort of further development in these former farmlands. In also another work, I encountered narratives emphasizing class differences and mobility, and this is a common, it's a well-known factor, I think. A similar account is given by the service users as well, as some women walk through an empty field crossed by a railway line as a shortcut to the nearest public transport. As one of the interviewees commented, our feet would be covered in mud. We would wipe it off with grass and water so the minibus driver would pick us up. And finally, well, last but not least, while utilizing informal mobility options to overcome transport poverty, female domestic workers face also precarious mobilities. So due to not being registered with the metropolitan municipality, service was seized by the police for a month, the one that I interviewed the users of. The police had received a tip-off from the dolmuş drivers who would not let any other informal structures thrive in the mobility sector, causing service drivers to develop tactics, as one of the drivers illustrates. When we see the police, we run away if there's a place to escape. It doesn't matter if we burn a little more diesel. So just to conclude, the emergence of service as response to pandemic immobilities is a unique initiative by female domestic workers based on their social networks, their kind attitudes, and their search for a decent and humane mobility alternative. While domestic work is already different from most work due to social reproduction and of domestic labor at home and workplace, the pandemic blurred these borders even further, as the pandemic pushed women further to stay as subordinates in all these spheres of work and home. Service created an opportunity for them to become the constituent element of their daily mobility. In this sense, mobility through service is an act of commoning in a shared root, identity, and mobility culture. On the negative side, such a bottom-up approach or self-organized approach to transfer service provision rooted in informal structures and organizational negotiations brings further mobility precarity as the service clashes with more traditional dolmuş, which has gained legal ground over the years. Increasing such initiatives could lead to a greater tension and insecurity. So while devising a tailored solution to their mobility problems, domestic workers are pushed towards another informal arena. Even though service facilitates dialogue between domestic workers, it also creates an enclave, a tunnel between home and work, pushing women further away from the public sphere, therefore limiting their mobility network, especially if their sole mobility option is a service. While liberating mobility restrictions, service simultaneously produces class mobilities. Overall, service emerges as an instrument of further entrapment of female domestic workers in precarious mobilities. But to end on a positive note, I would say that considering interactions between work, residential, and mobility spheres has deepened our understanding of precarity and social reproduction. For me, as a mobilities and transport researcher, it definitely inspired me a lot on this, especially this sort of intersectional analysis. And so I see that there's a need to strengthen mobility research with migration, labor, and feminist geographies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edda. That was amazing, very interesting case study. And now, before we go on to the discussion, I would like to give a massive thank to all 5 presenters. More or less all presentations highlighted on the one side the violent realities that women and other feminized and marginalized subjects are experiencing, but at the same time they have you have pointed out the brighter side, those of recreating networks of solidarity and care. Now I'm leaving it upon you to questions or comments.